On stage are Associate Professor Ong Biao-Chi, Mr. Bernard Menon, Ms. May Tan, Mr. Wong Heng Fang. Mr. Stephen Forshaw is the moderator for community responses to COVID-19.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for joining us again for the second panel in this afternoon's Temasek Shophouse Conversation. My name's Stephen Forshaw. I'm very pleased to be your moderator for this afternoon, and I'm very, very delighted to introduce four distinguished panelists with me this afternoon. Starting at my far right, Associate Professor Ong Biao-Chi, Chairman of the Medical Board of Sengkang General Hospital, Singapore's newest public hospital. Professor Ong contributed significantly to the development of the hospital, but also to the hospital's program for its COVID-19 patients. So she'll have some great stories to share with us this afternoon. Bernard Menon, the Executive Director of the Migrant Workers Centre here in Singapore, itself a joint initiative of the NTUC and the Singapore National Employers Federation. He also serves as a director of NTUC's migrant worker segment. Bernard, thank you for joining us. May Tan. May is the co-founder of Kampong Kakis, a ground-up movement that matches needy families with volunteers in their local neighbourhoods. And she established Kampong Kakis after herself recovering from COVID-19 in early 2020 and noticing the need for such a service. So May will give us some very personal insights as well during her session this afternoon. Welcome, May. And on my immediate right, Mr. Wong Heng Fang, the Group CEO and Executive Director of Surbana Jurong, one of Asia's largest urban infrastructure and management services consulting firms, 16,500 staff across 40 countries. Himself a distinguished engineer and graduate of NTU, and now an adjunct professor at NTU in their School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Heng Fang, thank you also for joining. I think three things came out of the last panel that are worth picking up in this panel. Sean opened by saying that viruses don't respect borders. They don't respect ethnicity, they don't respect language. At the end of the day, they transmit very easily and very widely across communities. Professor Tan said that science has become very international. The sharing of experiences from scientists across the world has put us in a much better place than we've ever been in previous pandemics, particularly of this size and scale. But I think it was Dr. Jamila whose point brought it home to me in how we frame this panel. Solutions must come from communities. Where we do well, it often arises because of the communities themselves and how they acted. And I think let's pick that point up, and if I can start first with Professor Ong. Professor, what were the key points or the key things that you look back on in our community's response, and particularly in the healthcare setting where you are, that we would do well to learn from going forward?
Okay, so maybe I bring you back to SARS. Basically, I'm a SARS survivor. And at that time, I was a young doctor. But I worked with a colleague and friend who died during that period, like 3 weeks after we have worked together. So I think that was really a painful experience. And when this I think all of us hope that SARS would be the last that we have of a pandemic. So I think when it first started, many of us really had a heart-sinking feeling, especially when SARS gave us the experience that there was a lot of fear about healthcare workers and our families as well, right? So, you know, we looked back and then I asked myself, what did we not do well during SARS that we should do better this time, right? And I think we really have learned from it, and I must say, credit to the whole system. Two things that we really learned from the SARS experience. One was that we didn't get information fast enough during the SARS period, right? By the time we knew, it was like, you know, there was too much down water, right? So what that went well this time was the communication, transparency of information. I think even if you look today at gov.sg, you get almost instantaneous information. I think that is very, very laudable, right? Now, the other thing that I think we have done really well from that experience, which I think much of the world maybe that has not experienced SARS didn't have this opportunity, and that's the fact that we have no shortage of supplies. I think at no point in time did I feel that I'm compromising my safety or my staff's safety because we were short of something or other. And at no point in time did we feel that we were compromising patient care because we didn't have a piece of equipment that was necessary, right? In fact, I had a UK resident who was with me, one of our doctors, who helped manage the first patient that we had. And he went home, right? And 2 months later, he texted and said, you know, I'm now COVID positive because I manage a COVID ward in UK. And he said, I now appreciate why you were so anal and so strict about your SOPs, right? And I said, look, here's the whole SOP, please take it and use it, copy, share, right? But I think quite quickly we realized that maybe if you bring out the first picture for...
First slide, please, thank you.
Okay, so this was, you know, we had no difficulty getting everybody on board, even though it's Chinese New Year, coming up to 1 year. And I have to say, quite embarrassed myself that despite this was when hospital was being built, 2017, 2016. We had 5,000 workers on site, right? But I never asked the question, where did they live? So much so that when we saw this, okay, initially it was, we learned that unlike SARS, COVID is a community thing. SARS was very much a hospital disease, right? But this was a community disease. So initially, when we first saw patients from the community coming in, it was something like, of 50 swabs, I get maybe 1 or 2 positive. And then they alerted me and said, hey, there is this group of patients coming from somewhere where if you get 5, it will be 3 positive. And over 2 or 3 days, instead of like 5, we had 15, then 50. And one day, because of language and issues, it took us a while to realize, once I asked one of them, where are you from? He couldn't quite say. So I said, how did you come here? And this guy who was COVID positive, 38-degree temperature, said, I walked here. This was when I told my team, hey, look, folks, we are at the bottom of this river, right? And we are picking people out, you know, like this. Over a few days, it went from like 5 to 50. We are just picking people out like this. It's not going to make it, right? We should go and find out whether there's something upstream. Maybe there's a waterfall. Maybe we need to build a fence around that waterfall so that nobody else drops in and we don't have to be picking people out from the bottom of the river. So when, I must say, even for myself, when I went to the dorm, it was an eye-opener to see 12,000 people there. Now, what did we do well? What we did well was, you know, all the ministries stepping up. When we went there, there was MOM, SPF, SAF, everybody was there. But at the same time, I found that it's difficult because we are all disparate. All of us are trying to do our best in an area that we are no experts. How do you then coordinate information and movement so that we are fast enough? So for example, when we noted, hey, it's all coming from this block or it's all coming from this construction site, how can we do it faster so that we can cordon this off? I think Chua Chuan mentioned this as well, right? If we can cordon it off, it may have been a much better situation. right? And in that aspect, I think in the end it's about trust. When we realize that there's a group of people who will stay here, and it's not like every 2 weeks I'm on roster, and you stay here and we trust each other, we can openly discuss, hey, this is the problem. You know, if I want to do it like this, this is your problem and you can't do it, okay? How do we discuss what needs to be done from the medical perspective as opposed to the dorm operation, as opposed to top-down orders as well? How to make that balance so that we can let the ground staff have some say and get that information together, as well as let the whole nation and the whole government, in a sense, have consistency and uniformity, right? In the end, I think it's all about trust. And I will just say that everybody contributes, right? This is one of the workers who came excitedly and showed me his 2-day-old baby. And just very privileged to share these moments with them, right, when they build trust. And I think everybody contributed. The guys in yellow are actually dorm residents. They sort of said, hey, rather than sit here and do nothing, what do you need? Let us help. So, and then all the people behind are the ministry people, the volunteers, quite a few VWOs, right? Everybody coming out together. This was National Day.
Bernard, you represent the Migrant Workers Centre, and a large number of people that you work very closely with were very involved in this outbreak, leading the community response to help those in this situation. Talk us through what you saw and how you mobilised the community around looking after the welfare of the people who you were most charged to look after.
So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Temasek, for having me today. I think our involvement in this current crisis began all the way as far as early January. We were starting to see in other countries that COVID-19 was starting to take hold. And we knew, while we would hope for the best, we knew we had to prepare for the worst. One of the things about the migrant worker community in Singapore is, you know, back when Singapore as a country learned its SARS lessons and all those crises after that, I think at that time, the migrant worker community had not grown to the size that it is today. So much of the migrant worker community weren't here when we learned those lessons. So our immediate concern was, you know, how would we try to bring them up to speed in terms of knowledge? We ourselves, we had trust in our public institutions, our systems and our structures. And we knew that Singaporeans, you know, when faced with a crisis, tend to gel together pretty well. But migrant workers make up 1/4 of our population, 1/3 of our workforce. And, you know, looking at how COVID was starting to develop, if it were to take hold in a migrant worker dormitory, for example, then we could have in our hands beginnings of a major crisis. So even before the first case visited our shores, we began to go out and engage a lot of migrant workers, different communities at work sites, workplaces, at dormitories, sometimes thousands at a time, speaking to them about, you know, what we knew for sure at that time, how you can protect yourself, what precautions you can take, you know, washing your hands, keeping yourself safe. 2-meter distance was what we were trying to disseminate at that time. And then, quite inevitably, migrant worker cluster was formed. And, you know, in peacetime, we are a migrant employment NGO. So, you know, our bread and butter is basically representing migrant workers with employment disputes. And there's no real organization or body or people or individuals that basically have as their main occupation helping migrant workers, you know, through a crisis like this. So I think for us, it was more or less, you know, they're empty shoes. No one to step in these shoes. You know, what can we do? And we pivoted much like a lot of businesses, we pivoted very quickly too. So our chief concerns began to become things like, how do we get enough masks in for all the migrant workers in all the dormitories? What do we do about food? And all these things. And yes, we did trust our public institutions that, you know, the Ministry of Manpower, Home Affairs, the Armed Forces would be brought in, that they'd look after the basic requirements. But there would be additional things that would need to be done in these migrant worker communities to assure them, to ensure that care is there, that they will not be left behind, and to continue to engage them throughout this process, especially when the dormitories came under lockdown. So I mean, I'm very grateful that the Migrant Worker Center ourselves, in doing our normal advocacy for migrant workers, we very early realized that, you know, no one can do anything alone. And so our chief strategy would be to work as an aggregator, partner with stakeholders, partner with corporates, and also form very tight relationship with our clients, so the migrant workers themselves. So we quickly immersed ourselves in migrant worker communities prior to COVID, and also worked with a lot of partners. And all this came back to revisit us when the dormitories got involved in this crisis. So all the supplies, we worked with corporates to acquire masks. We worked with Temasek Foundation, in fact, sanitizers, all which we would then supply to the dormitories and the workers that were there, numbers roughly about 400,000. On top of that, we had actually formed an ambassador network of migrant workers themselves, all living in the dormitories. And we never knew how valuable they would become until the dormitories came under lockdown. And I'm sure all of you would have read in the news, every time somebody refers to ambassadors at the dormitories, helping with the distribution of food, helping to ground sense, to see where the problems are, who was infected and things like that, working with the FAST teams on the ground. Those ambassadors they refer to are MWC ambassadors, 5,000 of them that continue to serve us even now. So in conclusion, I think I'm a lot like Prof. Ong. I think in some areas in our response to COVID-19, lessons from SARS maybe are invalid in terms of helping us. But the one thing we always have is our trust and our unity, our faith in our public institutions, the fact that our NGOs and our people in times of crisis have this amazing ability to overlook where we disagree and stand together. And I think that struck me through the whole experience as the one lesson, the one, if I may use a bit of a cliche, secret weapon that we have, that perhaps maybe it's not so easy to get, and perhaps other people may not have something as strong as ours.
Great, thanks Bernard. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching us online, we are open for questions as well, so please use the facilities to ask your questions. I'll see them and we'll have some further discussions with the panel with your questions as soon as they start coming in. Let me turn now to May. May, you have a very personal and very community-oriented perspective on this. How did you see it? And some of the points that you've just heard, for example, Bernard make about the importance of community coming together. You're right at the pointy end of that. Talk us through what it's meant for you and what you've observed in the community doing what you've been doing since COVID started.
Yeah, sure. So I actually have some slides, if I can flash that. Yeah, so as Stephen mentioned, I was actually case number 827, and after recovering from the hospital, I wanted to do something for the community, especially the marginalized groups, and that's where two of my friends and I came together to start Kampong Kakis, and as Stephen mentioned, it's a neighborhood buddy system. So why is this buddy system important, and why is this important for a future pandemic as well? Firstly, when the circuit breaker started, or lockdown for our international friends who don't know the term circuit breaker, a lot of the stay-alone seniors they were at the tail end of quite a broken telephone line. Prof. Ong, you mentioned we did do a very good job with disseminating information through gov.sg, a lot of our digital channels. But these seniors who used to get their information from hanging around coffee shops, hanging around senior activity centers, they were not receiving updates on new measures and new regulations. So with this buddy system, we're actually making sure that someone who is more savvy, who is able to receive news from online channels, is able to convey that to our seniors. I think in the previous panel, they mentioned that education is really important to make sure the community responds well to COVID-19 or a future pandemic. And a lot of these seniors were not being educated. So our Kampong Kakis are actually, the volunteers are actually very much like our educators to our seniors as well. So just some pictures. These were taken more recently of our volunteers and the seniors. The second thing why this neighborhood buddy system was so important is that it allowed the individuals in the community to build that kind of trust. And as both Prof. Ong and Bernard mentioned, trust and unity is really important in this time. We wish this was started earlier because then our seniors would have someone that they could easily call upon in times of a pandemic to say, hey, what's going on? And very often, in a pandemic like this, and we've seen in news, right, mental health issues tend to escalate. I think the news reported that SOS hotline calls increased 30 to 35%. Family violence cases, I think, increased about 22% during the April to May period. So our Kampong Kakis are very much like the eyes and ears of our marginalized groups on the ground as well, and they're able to detect signs of distress early on. And our government has done phenomenal jobs, and all the community groups together as well, in meeting the basic needs like providing food, meals, masks, sanitizing packages, financial assistance especially. But I feel like the mental health and psychological needs were not as well met. And I'm pretty sure, for next pandemic, if we can come together to put in place frameworks that will also meet those needs, then we are providing a more holistic, solution to meeting the community needs on the ground. Okay, and I think to my last point, it would be that actually, we've mentioned that this is a disease for the community to fight. And what we've realized, through Kampong Kakis is that by empowering the individuals of our community, they can really step up and really play a part and make a big difference in how we solve the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. So what we did is we actually put together a resource kit for all our volunteers. We put down the financial schemes. We partnered with over 20 community groups, to the point on unity again, to put together resources that were very key and relevant during this period. And armed with this resource kit, our volunteers were able to guide and help, families struggling with financial difficulties or seniors facing some problems to improve their situation during the time of the pandemic. And I think more and more now, our volunteers are also becoming like an extra pair of eyes, ears, and very helpful hands to our social workers because they tend to be on the ground, whereas our social workers can then take a step back and look at policies, right? And we find that we are actually building a more resilient community in that way because we are now a bridge for the general public and these marginalized groups, and making us more resilient for a future pandemic. Touch wood, yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, May. Hiang Fine, you represent an organisation that's used to designing cities and working for years to build infrastructure, but in a matter of days you came together as a team and built a remarkable community care facility. What was the key learning for you in applying your own efforts as a leader, but also in what you did to help the community?
Well, thank you, Stephen. I think looking back, when we were first tasked to look all over Singapore at all the facilities and repurpose them into healthcare facilities, I think one thing that struck us very deeply was that every facilities that we look at were very single-purpose building. And to repurpose them into something else was extremely difficult. So we took that as a lesson, and I think, the things that we came back with was that in future, when we do facilities, whether it's urban or infrastructure, we better look at how we can repurpose them into some other use, going forward. So just maybe you can bring up the slide.
Sure.
Yeah. So, we did the expo, and I will tell you a little bit about some secret, that a lot of people doesn't know. We went to the National Stadium, and refit out with tentages. So DPM talk about agility, collaboration. I would say that today, every of the facilities that we have done, without the collaboration among the local partners as well as overseas, we wouldn't have been able to complete it. And one of the key things that was really severely missing in all the facilities that we've seen was common toilets. So this is an example where we designed a portable toilet that we can, what we call it, plug and use. So today we have done about 300 of them, and deploy them across the island so that we can refit all these facilities and, of course, offer safe and secure facilities for the people. The secret about the thing is that, the speed that we do. I remember on the 29th of March, on a Sunday, the line gave me a call and said, hey, why don't you go down to Expo and take a look? So we went down and we got the green light to go ahead on the 3rd, without knowing that in the afternoon, PM declared circuit breaker on the 7th. So we had literally a few days to draw up all our plans, appoint the contractors, and move in the workers. And the first 2 halls was operational really on the 7th. But we didn't have, we couldn't admit the patients because we got to pass the NCID approval. So it took us a couple of days. And on the 10th, we received our first patient at 8 p.m. A lot of people didn't know that we finished that hall only at 6:30. Because during this circuit breaker, we literally ran out of things. This was the first time when we do project that even with money, we couldn't execute it. So with the help of Boon Hyung, we got in touch with the Indonesian embassy, who then got us manufacturers in Indonesia to turn out our beds and so on. We called up Ken Ping from NTUC to open up his warehouse so that he could get us, the plastic containers, because we ran out of all the cabinets. There was no cabinets in Singapore. So we got to improvise, drilling the holes in the cabinets, because we also have to consider the safety of the workers. If any one of them have a fight over lost items, we'll be in deep trouble. So we had to go and drill holes in the cabinets and put padlocks. And all this was done during circuit breaker. And as you can see, without workers, we can't do anything. Literally, we had to go and mobilize workers from our contractors to execute the job. So one of the key things that we like to suggest to a lot of the building owners, whether it's a hotel or convention centers, is really to think about how can we repurpose the facility in the event of emergency. Once you have that, you will be able to quickly mobilize and fit it out. So this was a very good lesson to us. I must say, none of the facilities was designed for that. And because of that, and because of the lockdown, we couldn't do quite a lot.
So next time a city in a couple of weeks, perhaps?
Yes. Of course, it changes our way of thinking.
Bernard, how important were the community care facilities for the migrant worker population?
So I actually wanted to make the comment myself because you mentioned that they were ready for on the 7th of April. In fact, you know, if you think about it, in a real world situation, it's incredible that they got that ready. The first dormitory came under lockdown, under Gazette, on the 16th of March. So you're talking about getting that facility ready for 8,000 occupants 3 weeks from when the first dormitory came under Gazette, which happens to be S11, where Prof. Ong was active also. So they had 14,000 workers, all living in close commune with each other, which, you know, for the purposes of COVID-19 would be dangerous. And there was an urgent need to be able to start segregating and cohorting workers. So, you know, I'm absolutely amazed at how, you know, our different communities, whether it's a business community, the people sector, the government agencies, how everybody came together. And thankfully, Mr. Wong, you also mentioned Kian Peng from NTUC, so which is, you know, obviously related to the organization I represent. Everyone came in and played a part, knowing that there was a crisis and it was critical that we act immediately. So, yeah, the community care facilities for the purposes of cohorting as part of the fight against COVID-19 were absolutely critical, Stephen.
And Prof. Ong, how were clinicians responding to the establishment of these new facilities? You're moving from treating people in a clinic or healthcare or hospital environment into this unheard of environment like a massive community care facility. Was it challenging?
Okay, so in fact, I think Bernard brought up this S11. At that point in time, even though we were rushing for the CCFs, there were actually not enough for the immediate. And in S11 itself, we ended up isolating 1,000, 1,500 within S11 itself, right? That's why when you asked, how did the medical people react to this? Of course, with great discomfort, right? When I spoke to my guys and they said, what, you're going to put people together like that? Who's going to take care of them? Is it going to be 24/7? Is it this? Is it that? Okay, the questions won't end. But we said, look, this is the best that we can do at this point in time. And I have to say the community came in because, like you say, there are no workers to be found. So people actually stepped up themselves and said, look, we can do this. We can get the tent up, right? To make this 1,000-bedded isolation facility, we did have to move people around. And their belongings had to move somewhere, right? How were we going to do that? People worked 24/7, even on the ground. And they were willing because when I said, look, I'm sorry, it's a weekend. I know you haven't had a break. Do you mind working this weekend? Because one day means a lot. There's so many people who are going to get infected in just one day. Yeah. And the guys told me, look, don't apologize. It's our community. This is where we live. We will do it. Just tell us what you need and how we're going to do it, right? So that is really very, very impressive, I think.
So what we're talking about here is the community response when it first happened. Let me touch on one of the questions that came through from one of our participants online. It seems that transparency, trust, connections underpin many of the early success stories in reaching out and caring for the vulnerable. But these are not our natural behaviour during a crisis when our first instincts are often to look inwards. What's the piece of advice that you can give to build and nurture this culture, to keep that culture of always looking outward instead of going back inwards? Let me maybe start with May, if I may, on this. The community aspect of this, how do you keep people focusing on others instead of looking at themselves?
Yeah, I think that's really important and a great point. I feel that we have to stop looking at helping others just from a lens of volunteerism or social work. And I think many of our volunteers that have stepped forward, they see themselves more as a friend helping, a kind neighbor. it's more about building neighborliness, which can be cultivated, from school, from parents teaching their children to look out for their neighbors. I think for myself, my parents always, helped to deliver food to one of my stay-alone seniors in my neighborhood. And that's where that kind of thinking and selflessness sort of started bubbling in me. Yeah.
Prof, how do you see, how do we inculcate that culture of getting people to look more beyond themselves during a time of crisis especially? I mean, you went through SARS, you have now been through COVID, disease X is the big one. How do we try and inculcate that into our culture?
I don't know. In fact, I think it underpins this whole conversation. It's about trust. It's about being open, right? I mean, it's not that we knew everything. On the ground, sometimes I said, I don't know, right? And then someone else will feel comfortable that if you're willing to say, I don't know, somebody else will come and say, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that, and encouraging people to come up with ideas openly. So for example, how do we create a space for something it wasn't designed, right? Even in the dorms, we had, thank you for bringing up toilets. Toilets was the biggest nightmare, and we had to figure out what to do, right? But it's also creating trust that I'm not here to prove that I'm right. I'm not here to sell something, but we are here together. That's why I said, in the end, it was a privilege to share their lives. And they were open to share that, you see. So I think what May has said is very important. I wish that this ambassador, this community with other people, volunteerism, is a continuous thing. It's not during a pandemic or during some crisis. In fact, I think Singaporeans are very generous. When there's a crisis, everybody steps up, right? But underpinning that, how do we always have a communication which inculcates trust, openness, right? Yeah.
If I can build on that point of trust and openness, and come to you, Bernard, with this question from Lin Tang, who's asked, can you say how lockdown conditions were like for the migrant workers and how we supported their physical, emotional, and mental well-being? And if I can take that a step further by saying, today, where are we? Are we in a better place with that community here in Singapore than we were before COVID? Or are there lessons still to be learned?
I'll answer like this. I do think we're in a better place than when we first began. But I also think there continue to be lessons to be learned. And much like handling any other unprecedented crisis, these lessons will come. Some lessons we have yet to learn and will continue to learn as we go along. But to answer Lynn's questions, I think when the decision was taken, certainly I wasn't there, but when the decision was taken that one of the ways to handle the crisis and the rise of infections among migrant worker communities would be to go where there were clusters in the dormitories and possibly gazette them as isolation zones. When this announcement was first made, I myself had some reservations, having dealt with migrant worker communities extensively over a period of 20 years. I think my fear was that the people that were making the decision need not necessarily know migrant workers, their culture, their behavioral norms, religion, aspirations, fears, anxieties, things like that. But the good thing was that, when the government agencies came in to the dormitories, they adopted a very willing to learn mentality, I think they came in early on. In many instances, they asked for the MWC, for one of my ops teams to be there with them on the ground. Not only to bridge the gap in terms of communication in the native language, but also because, we have the experience. So let me know, can I do something like this? Would it be okay with them if I were to do something like this? Would they take it the wrong way? And to also try and learn certain aspects of the behavior of migrant workers. So, for example, one of the things that many people may not know is that migrant workers tend to want to be in close commune with each other. And we learned the hard lesson later on when we started isolating them one by one in hotel rooms. That was when the emotional distress and all came about, because they were in extended isolation by themselves, which to them was your big no-no, you see. And so we had to come in again, consult in many instances. So all over the response, whether it's the CCFs, whether it's the dorms in isolation, whether it was the hotels, or even the army barracks that were used in some instances, to isolate workers as well. In many instances, at least I found in my experience, that all the government agencies, all the partners that were tasked with running, setting up and all these, they were very open to advice. And in most cases, they sought advice themselves quite organically. So I think as far as the experience was, we all know that being in extended isolation for maybe a period of 2 months would be uncomfortable for anyone. Yeah. But I think every possible step, precaution, assistance that could be given to the migrant worker communities was ultimately extended. So I think, looking back, I thought knowing that it would be uncomfortable was one thing, but we managed to mitigate all those things as far as possible, as far as our abilities allowed. Yeah.
Yang Fine, can I pick up on a point? If you go back a step to what you do as your day job, you and your colleagues are thinking long-term about the planning of cities. You talked earlier about when we're building buildings, we should think about how they can be repurposed for emergency facilities. Maybe it's a little early yet, but how do you think about some of these mental health challenges that are arising here in terms of the future design of facilities?
Well, I think, through this period, we literally learned quite a lot. I mean, just to give you an example on the migrant workers, we were told that one of the biggest requirements that we have to set up was a very good Wi-Fi system, because they wanted to download, instantly the movies and so on, and that was not the top of our priority. We were worried about fire safety, whether there will be enough showers for them, and then where they're going to wash their clothes, So we set up temporary laundry facilities, but Wi-Fi was never on top of mind. So we got to scramble, to go and make sure that we fill up in every hall a very superb Wi-Fi system for them. Because that was one of the things that kept them, really engaged. And some of you would have watched a video that the migrant workers were so happy that they created a dance in the expo hall. So, I think some of these things, are really the joy that we take when we look at doing our designs and so on. So I guess going forward, when we look at designing of cities and so on, we really need to understand the culture, and the requirements, because certain things to us are important, but others are even more important to the community.
Yeah, so it's all very well to look at hard infrastructure, it's all very well to look at clinical procedures and so on, but culture, psychology, mental health impact are going to be increasingly important. That's probably one, I think what you're saying, all of you are saying, is that's probably one of the big takeouts from COVID-19.
So,
on that point, I think we cannot underemphasize the power of the people themselves. So despite everything that we do, what I realize is among themselves, they actually had a very big social group. And at one stage, this guy in a dorm had a social group of about 25,000 followers. And that's where we made use of, for example, volunteers. My doctors who spoke the language became a guest, and that's how we disseminated information and education. And it's because it's hosted by one of their own people. People believed what was said, right? And that was very, very powerful. Much more than us coming in and doing education and all that, right? Including the building and all that. And I guess to some extent we were very lucky, because after a while, the FAST team that was in S11, many of them volunteered to stay on. And they were so engaged, and we knew each other so well that it became almost like a community. It's like your second home kind of thing.
There's a couple of questions here, and I'm going to sort of group them and ask a number of you the same question. But Prof, you just touched then on people volunteered. How hard was it to get people to volunteer knowing that they were going into the face of, in some cases, the red zone, into dangerous territory? How hard was it to convince people, or were they very willing to step forward?
I have to say we had no difficulty at all from the medical point of view. I mean, one of the things is, I mean, the leadership went forward. We said, look, I'm scared, but if I think that it's safe enough for me, I think a lot of my staff after that sort of said, well, we are all scared, but if it's good enough for my leader, it must be good enough for me. And people just volunteered. There was no shortage of people who were willing to volunteer, both from the medical front, from the community, and like I said, even the people who are supposed to be rostered 2 weekly from the various ministries, doing something that they are not supposed to be doing in their daily life, they stayed on. They said, look, we'll stay on.
So the interesting point, I was watching as you said that all of you were nodding. So I'm surmising that you're all going to say pretty much the same thing. But what you're actually saying to us is that leadership matters, but that people at the right time will step up and do the right thing. How important is it that we inculcate that? How do we inculcate that into our culture going forward? We were in wartime. How do we make sure that we keep that in peacetime? May, you're trying to do just this with the community. How do we inculcate that culture in peacetime?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about building that spirit of looking out for one another in the community. I would say that I think we should, as a community and with the government, Prof mentioned about leadership, so it's very important for the government to also give the frameworks and the rails that allows community groups like us to continue fostering that kind of unity and that kind of trust between the marginalized groups and those people who are able to provide. I think that's very important. Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to ask all of you one question to conclude, if you maybe take a minute or so. What, in your view, could we have done better? Reflecting on it, and I'm not asking you to critique anyone here, but what, if you could wind the clock back? DPM said earlier it's a year ago. If you could wind the clock back a year, what would you do differently? Prof?
$1 million question.
Yeah.
I guess what I really felt we could have done better is we could have been faster at aggregating information. Because I think when I look back now and I speak to the people on the ground, the people managing the dorms, they did see early on a pattern, right? And even from the hospital point of view, we saw a pattern. All the cases were coming from a certain block, right? But how could we have put that information together fast enough, percolated upwards, sideways, downwards, and acted fast enough to cordon that? I'm not even sure I have the solution to this, but if you ask me what I felt we could have done better, because I think when we went in, even over 1 week, you could see the evolution. You could really plot it out on a curve that was going exponentially up, and we were behind slightly on the curve.
Yep, okay. Bernard, keep it quite fast.
Yeah. I would say I would have put more effort and time into building our grassroots network among migrant workers. They've been invaluable to the entire national response, not only the MWC. And I think if we'd have known that we'd be faced with something like COVID-19, we would have grown the network at a much quicker rate to a much larger body of volunteers. I just want to add one other point on what you said about how do we make sure we inculcate, this value of giving and volunteering and things like that. I think it's important. It was important with SARS. It's going to be important now. And as we move on to hopefully finally conclude this battle with COVID-19, it'll be important to tell the stories.
Yeah.
Because that's how we keep this in the institutional memory,
Yep.
so to speak, how everybody came together, and so that for our younger ones, you know, and our kids, they may not have been through the experience, but they will always have something to fall back on.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yang Fine, about 60 seconds for you. What if you could wind the clock back a year, what would you want to see done differently or do differently yourself?
I think going through this, quick decision making without that fear of making mistakes is very crucial in a crisis. Yeah. Just looking back, I mean, we didn't know what the virus is all about. Yeah. So to us, we've all been trained to be very mission focused. Yeah. I mean, we set out ourselves, we must achieve this. Yeah. And so we are very dedicated in doing that. Yeah. So really, in getting that decision made quickly, I think is crucial.
May, a very personal insight to close it all off. It's been a very challenging year for you. What would you have done differently a year ago?
Yeah, I would say I would not hesitate to spend more time in the community. I think before COVID, personally, I felt that I didn't do enough to really, build the kind of community around me where I live. So if I could wind the clock back, I would have started that much earlier so that when COVID happened, I would immediately know where the seniors in my neighborhood that I could reach out to and help them. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, I think one thing comes through from this discussion very clearly for me. We heard in the last panel about the importance of science and collaboration. All of that takes time. What we heard here from 4 people on this panel were time wasn't on our side. There were no rule books to follow, so we made it up as we went along. And what you heard today were remarkable success stories. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank this panel for sharing very personal and very deep insights as to their impact on the community from COVID-19. Thank you.